We're ready to start, so please mute everyone. For those of you who may not know me, I am Nan Nelson, co-chair of the Ecology Committee. The Ecology Committee and the leadership of MAI are delighted that so many of you have joined us on this virtual adventure. Monhegan Associates is thrilled to be able to offer our speaker series online this year. Let it be known right up front that I bow down to Tish Miller, Rebecca Fitzpatrick, and Claire Durst for making the technology piece happen. Thank you for spearheading this, ladies. This evening, I am delighted to introduce our speaker. Bill Livingston will be sharing his perspective on the health of Monhegan's woodlands. Having received his Master's of Science from the University of Idaho in Forest Science and his doctorate in plant pathology from University of Minnesota, he is currently an associate professor and associate director of undergraduate programs in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine. Since 1985, he has taught classes there and has conducted research on tree biology and forest health. Bill is not a newcomer to Monhegan. He first visited the island around the year 2000. Between 2002 and 2006, Bill worked with graduate students to collect data on the island. In 2008, he presented his first ecology talk for Monhegan Associates. To prepare for this evening, Bill returned to the island in June to walk our forest paths and examine the state of things. Tonight, he will share his observations. As you may be aware, field abandonment in the early 1900s resulted in an unprecedented succession of white spruce, which in turn led to widespread mortality in the 2000s. Invasive plants also intruded. The challenge for the Ecology Committee has been how to manage or not manage these changes in order to be true to our mission of preserving the wildlands. There will be time for questions after the lecture. If you have a question, please write your question in chat. The chat button is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So, with no further ado, I present Bill Livingston speaking on forest dynamics and the Monhegan Island community. Bill?
Thank you, Nan. And also thanks Tish, Claire, and Rebecca for helping to put this together. I have to say one of the advantages of doing a Zoom meeting is I can see everybody's name, so I'm not sweating it out trying to remember who's who. So again, my thanks to everybody who's helped to organize this. It's great island you have out there, and I think being able to preserve the woodlands and for the enjoyment of all to visit it is just a wonderful opportunity that you've given the community there. And what I'm going to be talking about this evening is really just something I really enjoy doing. I love getting out to forests. I love to try to figure out what's happening in the forest. And then most of all is try to get a sense as to what's going to happen to the forest in the future. So it's been a real pleasure. I've now been out to the island for over 20 years. And it's each time I go out there, it's a special occasion. So I'm really glad I had the chance to walk the trails in early June. That is still the best way to see the island and to talk about it. But I just can't do a nature walk with 30 other people, especially on such diverse areas. So this opportunity this evening to do it through Zoom really helps connect to more people. And so the next time all of you are out on the island, I hope you understand it a bit better and appreciate it a bit better after what I talk about this evening. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. It will bring up a PowerPoint presentation. I may need to do a few clicks to get it doing what I want it to do. And then during the presentation, I do have a touch screen, so you'll see me zooming in and out on images. It's nothing wrong with your computer. I'm just fooling around with the screen on mine. And then I also will try and annotate it. So you may see some red lines appearing, and that is an indication this is what where on the slide I'm referring to. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Okay, I think I've got things ready on my end. How's it look on yours? Everybody can see the
No, we do not see the video. We see your desktop.
Desktop. We
Oh,
see your
really?
desktop, yeah.
Okay, let me try that again. How about this?
Yes, fine.
Okay. So I'm gonna move this. Okay. So talking about forest health, the dynamics and the Monhegan community. So really what we're looking about, I'll really cover a lot of material. If any of you were there for my talk in 2008, I will be reviewing a lot of that because that's just basic to set the stage for what I'm seeing 13 years later. And so it's involved looking at some old images that we found of the island and then piecing them together to try and look at the forest history and to explain the type of forest communities we have out there. And then based on that, try and figure out what's going to happen in the future. So definitions. So the way I think about healthy and natural is that it's key part of biology is looking at that species have evolved and adapted to each other. So the natural environment is where you have species that have evolved in that environment and have adapted to the environment and to each other. And this results in recognizable communities. So we have what we call the spruce fir forest or the northern hardwood forest. These are recognizable communities that we recognize as species that have evolved to each other with each other and form sustainable dynamic communities. And so they're always responding to the environment. I'm calling these sustainable, but they're really not static. They're always changing. So we always will have forest succession, and for a healthy forest, it will always regenerate a new forest after disturbance. So this is what I'm always looking for to decide, is this forest healthy or is it not? Are the species there adapted to what's going on? And are they responding to the environment as they've adapted? So that's what I think of as healthy and natural. So what can disrupt this health? As Nan referred to, can deal with land use history changes. And I've seen this in many, many examples that this results in a lot of the forest health problems that we're seeing today. One that fortunately you haven't had on Monhegan and you've done your best to avoid is dealing with fire. The fire exclusion in many parts of the country, especially out west, has resulted in really a disruption of the natural dynamics of that forest. And you're getting different species regenerating that can't tolerate the dry conditions. The stands become too dense. And then you get these catastrophic fires that we're now seeing out west. It's an indication that the forest dynamics out there have really been disrupted and they're really suffering horribly because of that. In the Northeast, thankfully, our disruption is a lot more benign, but still has an impact on the forest, and that's the old fields. That on the old fields, trees will regenerate on a site that would otherwise not be there. They're only there because that we had gone in, cleared off the original trees, and it became a field. So it's initiated this unnatural, what I call unnatural development on the site, and that can lead to problems. And here in Maine, inland, it's white pine that came in the old fields in southern part of Maine, and I've studied white pine decline problems associated with that. And then out on the islands, just not Monhegan, but a lot of the islands up and down the coast of Maine, white spruce came in on the old fields. And we have a lot of old fields on the island because when the Europeans first came, it was a convenient place to do grazing. And so a lot of islands were cleared off. They put out the livestock because they didn't need fences. And so a lot of the islands were cleared off and became fields for grazing. Another part that really scares me about the natural condition of the forest is dealing with non-native invasive species. That there are non-native insects that kill trees, emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, and then an insect that's out on Monhegan Island and affects a tree out there is balsam woolly adelgid. That's really impacted the health of the balsam fir up and down the islands. You don't see a lot of balsam fir on Monhegan, and the adelgid is probably one of the reasons why. You can have fungi and other microorganisms killing trees. Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight are examples of those. And then what's really affected Monhegan are the invasive plants. And what's pictured here is barberry back around 1999, 2000 up by the ball fields. And these, the danger to them is you don't see them killing trees directly. Asiatic bittersweet, you can see doing that. That's the vine that crawls up trees and can eventually strangle them or shade them out. But the primary damage from the invasive species is they prevent regeneration of the native species, and therefore disrupt the natural dynamics of the forest community. So non-native invasive species, and especially the plants, invasive plants, are a real threat to the health of forests. So first part I'll talk about is Richard Dyer was a graduate student back in 2001 to 2003, and he spent a summer out on the island and got a lot of great plot data on the different parts of the island that we could then relate to the land use history. To go back even further, we'll first talk about what Monhegan looked like ever since the glacial period ended. This is based on pollen studies. So out on the marsh, pollen falls on the water, sinks down to the bottom of the water body, and then because of lack of oxygen, the pollen does not degrade, does not decompose, it gets preserved. And then Bostic in 78, and then another study by Tolanen in 83, identified what species of trees could be identified as being on Monhegan during these time periods. So they were able to find pollen that's almost 10,000 years old. And this follows a typical succession of species we've seen in other spots of Maine. When the glacier period first ended, it was dominated by spruce, birch, and pine, that it was still cold and favored the spruce species, but that didn't last very long. Then we entered a period of warm, dry weather, warmer and drier than what we've seen in recent history. And these forests were dominated by white pine, birch, and oak that you typically see on drier locations. And then the climate started to moderate more. We saw hemlock, a shade tolerant species that came in around the marsh about 3,500 years ago. There must have been some disturbance, and it was primarily birch and shrubs pollen that was falling in there. And then we enter a long period of spruce dominated forests. Over 3,000 years. Inland in Maine, it's really just been in the last 1,000 years that the spruce forests have dominated. But out on the islands where you have the moderate maritime climate and more moist conditions, that's really favored red spruce growth. And red spruce has been a dominant forest out on the islands for over 3,000 years. And we have 2 species, and the speculation is, based on what we've seen recently, is that white spruce you find near the shore, and red spruce is in the interior. And I'll explain why that's happening in a moment. But one of the first Europeans to describe Monhegan in 605, Rozier, this is a quote from one of his writings: "This island is woody, grown with fir, birch, oak, and beech as far as we saw along the shore, and so likely to be within." So clearly, when the Europeans came, this island was dominated by forests. So looking at the different spruces, white spruce. White spruce biologically is intermediate in shade tolerance, meaning that it needs some sunshine, some sunlight in order to regenerate. It cannot regenerate in full shade. Because it is adapted to the fuller sunlight, it has a wide range of moisture conditions, so it can regenerate in moist soils or drier soils. However, it cannot survive suppressed conditions, suppressed meaning suppressed by shade. So in full shade, the white spruce will not regenerate. It requires some open conditions. It's not a very long-lived species. It's only, especially on the islands, what we've seen, can actually grow quite quickly in the younger ages and put on amazing growth rings up to 1 inch diameter, which would be 2 inches diameter a year in growth early on. But then it gets 80 years old, it slows down, and then in about 100 years, they start to die off for various reasons. So they're not a long-lived species. Most likely they came to Monhegan after the last glacier period. That prior to the glacier period, or during the interglacial periods over the last 100,000 years, red spruce has been on the island, but white spruce was isolated more to the north and more to the west. So it has not been on this area of the continent until after the last glacier. This is the species that becomes severely affected by dwarf mistletoe. Dwarf mistletoe the eastern species we have, is thought to have been isolated from white spruce. It stayed on red spruce. Red spruce was on the coastal areas during the glacial period. And so the red spruce and dwarf mistletoe have evolved together. The white spruce was separated by the glacier and was not exposed to the mistletoe during this period. So when it re-entered Monhegan Island, the species just really did not have the resistance to this parasite that we see with the red spruce. And so with these characteristics, when the old fields were abandoned, this was the primary species that was best adapted to come in under those conditions. Normally the white spruce would have just stayed on the edge of the island, but when the old fields were abandoned, the white spruce invaded and went into interior sections where it hadn't grown before. This is in contrast with red spruce. It was present on the East Coast during the glacier period. What's now the continental shelf was actually dry, and a lot of the red spruce forests were thought to exist on what's now the continental shelf. And so the red spruce has been here along the coast and in the southern Appalachias all through the glacier period. Because it's thought that dwarf mistletoe was present with the red spruce, it's relatively unaffected. And it's partly also because, as I'll talk about in a moment, that in these red spruce forests, these are just not good conditions for the mistletoe to spread. For red spruce, it does need shade and moisture. It needs ample moisture to regenerate. So those foggy days you have out on the island is just fantastic for the red spruce regeneration. Germination establishment is best under shade. Once it gets established, it can persist for decades in the shade. You can have a tree that's 6-7 feet tall and be 100 years old. But then as soon as an old tree falls down and light comes into the forest, that tree responds immediately. So red spruce is a long-lived species. It can be, well a couple centuries old, and I've heard reports of where they've had red spruce up to 400, 600 years old. So, similar looking species, but biologically quite different in their adaptations and how they respond to the conditions out on the island. Okay, looking at the change in forest cover. Rick was able to find these maps, drawn sketches done in different periods. So he found out really from 1605, when the island was first recognized by the Europeans and started to be colonized, to 1780. The history is not well documented, but really the 1800s, starting in 1800s, could get well documentation that there was land clearance, fires, intensive agriculture, and especially the grazing. And so this sketch of the island in 1873, it shows where there's wet areas or forested areas, and it shows most of the southern half of the island was cleared of the forest. The sketch in 1922 showed that areas were starting to come back into trees. And then modern day is what we see here, that the forest is considered to be covering half of the southern part of the island, whereas you have the village and then the edge of the island that pretty well remains clear of the trees. Okay, excuse me, there it goes. I've lost my pictures for some reason. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to stop the share and try and, see if I can get the pictures back. Okay. No, it didn't go where I wanted it. Okay. Can you see the slide again, and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about the interruption, but these glitches appear for no reason. That's the first time I've ever seen that happen, but we got it working again. Okay, so change in cover, so we could map these out, and we get this kind of nice mosaic of the island. And the light green are the periods where they were cleared the longest before it became reforested. So these were cleared back in the 1800s and also 1900s, but by 1960 that they had trees again. Magenta were cleared in the 1800s, but not 1920s. And then the dark green, this would be Cathedral Woods. Parts of the Cathedral Woods have always been forested. And these light blue areas were shown as being forested in the 1800s, but not 1900s. So the primary areas of interest are really the green and magenta. These were the ones that were fields and then came back to forests. And based on what we've seen, most of these areas, especially the light green, came back to white spruce. And we looked at the mortality in the 1990s. that most of the mortality was occurring in these white spruce stands growing in the old fields. Why was this happening? As you can see here, this is one of my first trip out to the island where some of the white spruce, dead white spruce, were still standing, and it was just a horror show. Just, you know, the dead trees, the dwarf mistletoe. It's a parasitic plant, so this enlargement actually shows the dwarf mistletoe plant. It's this little flowering stalk that comes out of the twig. It isn't much longer than the needle, so it's quite short. But it changes the growth physiology of the tree, and you can get these large brooms. It's basically acts like a cancer tumor. It causes excess growth of the plant tissue. The mistletoe generates some hormones that stimulate the growth of the tree tissue. And as the tree tissue grows, it attracts food coming in from the surrounding branches, and that food will then go into the mistletoe plant. So it's a way of it to get more food to regenerate itself. Then it produces seeds in these shoots, and these seeds will then shoot to other plants, and the plant will spread from tree to tree. So with the white spruce not evolving with the dwarf mistletoe, it was more vulnerable to getting infections. And the open fields, where you had these large full crowns of targets, and the seed could spread very easily between these openly grown trees, the intensification of the dwarf mistletoe in these conditions just happened rapidly. So by the 1990s, the white spruce in these old fields were just being decimated by the brooms and the energy draining nature of the dwarf mistletoe plants. On other islands in Maine, and during the same time period, it's like the cycle was similar on others, where the fields were abandoned by 1900 and spruce came back. So about 100 years later, the spruce started to die off. On other islands, it was the spruce beetle, a native insect, and that's its role, is basically to kill off the mature trees that are on the process of dying, so that the next forest can replace it. So on Monhegan, it was the dwarf mistletoe. On other islands farther up the coast of Maine, it was the spruce beetle killing off the white spruce. So this was not happening just on Monhegan, but was happening on many islands up and down the coast of Maine. The white spruce forest that regenerated 100 years ago in the old fields were dying off. In contrast, you go to the Cathedral Woods area where red spruce dominates, and that forest had no problems. Red spruce, 74% of the stems, some balsam fir out there, and a few hardwoods. Multi-aged at the time, Rick aged these with tree cores back in the early 2000s. The oldest age he got was 185 years old. The average age was 90. What we found in the ground cover, in addition to red spruce regeneration, which was 76% of the trees regenerating, was flora you'd expect in northern red spruce forest. Canada mayflower, wild raisin, starflower. Really, it was, if you wanted to see a good maritime example of a red spruce forest, the Cathedral Woods is a great example of that. So what did we find in the early 2000s replacing the white spruce? White spruce had died off. Then the effort went out to cut down the white spruce and put it on the ground so that it would not be the fire hazard. And then what was coming in to replace them? And fortunately in Maine is that as long as you don't mow it, trees are going to come back. And what Rick found in the field at that point was red spruce. 46% of the seedlings coming up were red spruce, 33% were white spruce, and then a mix of hardwoods, especially mountain ash. And the other plants included the grasses from the old fields, and goldenrod, and also there was some raspberry out there. But really, what we found encouraging was that you did get the spruce trees starting to come back. Then, beginning in about 2004, Jennifer D'Apollonio did her MS thesis working with Japanese barberry on where it's invading forests. She did some research and to say how recent is this or how long has it been here. And I was kind of surprised. She was looking at it that there was reports of it in Boston in 1875, and then reports of it along coastal areas really for 100 years. So Japanese barberry, good chance it's been out on Monhegan for quite a while and has been developing over time. Unfortunately, it still remains as a popular ornamental shrub. So even in my neighborhood, I go by people's lawns and I see it in hedges along the field, along their yards. I gotta make sure that I don't cut it out for them. That's not allowed, but it's unfortunate that it's still planted, even though we've shown how much a threat it is to our native forests. On Monhegan, it have been out there for decades. And when I first came out there, that especially up by the ball field, you just had areas of the forest where the Japanese barberry had completely dominated the understory. This was favored up through the 90s. You had a high deer population that would eat everything but the barberry. So this helped the plant to spread. It's an invasive plant, and it had a tendency to grow longer. It had an extended growing season compared to the native plants. So it could basically elbow out the other species, native species on the site by able to grow longer, occupy more space more quickly. What's unusual for invasive species, most invasive species are shade intolerant. They got to be growing in full sunlight. That's not true with Japanese barberry. It can persist and grow with as little as 3% light. So with these characteristics, and given the time and given the exclusion of other species because of deer browse, the Japanese barberry just overwhelmed a lot of the understory of some of the forests on Monhegan. So again, to say, why is this a health problem? Well, in Cathedral Woods, you can see examples of here. This is how the understory should be. You've got a lot of red spruce regenerating. So when the wind blows and some of these old trees fall down, it's going to be immediately occupied by the red spruce. However, where you have the barberry, you do not have the trees established. And when the overstory there, trees begin to fall down from natural occurrences, you're just going to have barberry left on the site. So, the barberry is a definite threat to the health of the forests on the islands and elsewhere. Thanks to the efforts of people on the Ecology Committee and Monhegan Associates, there were definitely intensive efforts to reduce the amount of barberry on the island. So this is what was reported to me, that in all these years, they were clearing off various parts of the trails to try and reduce the amount of barberry that's in the woods, to open them up and to allow natural regeneration to occur. I looked at this is critical. The changes I saw here, when I came out in 2008, I couldn't believe the changes I saw in the forest, from where I had seen a wall of forest edge to forest edge of Japanese barberry to where they had been opened up. So my kudos to all the efforts that people put in for reducing the barberry population during this time. So in summary, looking at the health issues on Monhegan Island. So the health problems involve factors to which the native species are not adapted. One big reason was land use history allowed the white spruce to come in, and then resulted in the declines, the mortality we see occurring in some of the pictures, older pictures of the island. So land use history is a big factor in determining the health of the forest. And then the invasive species. Further inland, where you have the emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, chestnut blot killing trees, but invasive plants are also a threat to the forest health, especially on Japanese barberry out on the island. So 2021. It was great. Nan contacted me. Gosh, Nan, I think that might have been a year ago. I was originally going to try and come out next year or last year, but of course we had to delay everything for a year. But I came back out early June 2021, met Rebecca and a few others, and we walked some of the trails. And the place I wanted to get to went down to Underhill and Burthead to really see what was happening in those old fields. And then also walked along Gull on Whitehead, and then also wanted to see what it's looking like in the Cathedral Woods. So couple days, did a lot of hiking and really enjoyed seeing what was happening to the forest on the island. So what's happening? In 2003, looking at the old fields, the former fields, is that we did find regeneration out there. What's hard to see is what I'm circling here now. That's a small spruce tree. So we had white spruce and red spruce germinating or regenerating out there. And then a lot of mountain ash was coming in as well. So what do I see in the fields in 21? Those spruce trees have grown up. That they're now, definitely trees. They're becoming well established. Mountain ash doesn't quite get as tall, so the spruce is gradually replacing the mountain ash. And there's parts of the trails you can go through now that really look like a shaded forest. What I found really interesting is I was a couple of weeks ago down in southwestern Virginia, looking at the forest down there, and went up to some of the mountaintops where red spruce can grow on them. And on some of the disturbed areas, it just looked like what I saw in the old fields on Monhegan, that you see the spruce regenerating on these sites with mountain ash. And so this really can say is you're getting now natural succession after disturbance of spruce forest coming back into the old fields. So very pleased to see what's happening there. The dwarf mistletoe is still present with white spruce on the island. It is not going to disappear, but definitely the infections and the number of infected trees in the stand is way down. And now that we're getting other species, a lot of red spruce in there, some hardwoods, to where you're getting isolation of the white spruce, the mistletoe is just not going to spread to the extent that it had after the initial field abandonment. So I think that's the good news I saw there, is in the old fields, these forests are developing. The regeneration we saw back in the early 2000s survived and is now growing. So the forest here is developing. You're going to have woodlands on these old field sites. Along the forest edge, still a lot of white spruce there, still a bit of mortality coming in. But that is the way the forest is going to be. It's too harsh an environment to get red spruce. You're not going to have red spruce coming in along the forest edges. Too little soil, too much wind, dries out too much sunlight. I just don't see red spruce developing there. Going to see dwarf mistletoe continuing on these trees, and you will gradually get mortality. It'll still be occurring in these pockets, but when they die off, you'll get some spruce continuing to regenerate. So along the edges of the forest, the woodlands probably aren't going to change too much. It's going to remain more of an open area with scattered white spruce. And it's a harsh environment. And then as the spruce matures, either the dwarf mistletoe or the bark beetle will likely kill off the mature trees, but the trees will continue to cycle through the young to the old. The Cathedral Woods is still a joy to go through. Rich's tree he cored 20 years ago is now over 200 years old. So that's where I can put that in there. So great old growth forests, but old growth forests are not static. They are constantly changing. So you'll get these areas where you have some blowdown, but because of the advanced red spruce regeneration, you can see areas where the red spruce is coming back thick. So again, this forest is sustainable, and it's going to be continually to be dominated by the red spruce. And even with the climate change, red spruce is really favored by the maritime environment. So unless things really change drastically, my expectation is that the red spruce forests out on Monhegan are going to remain that way for quite a while. The invasives, frankly, compared to when I first came out to the island, the invasive problem has been much reduced. Again, thanks to the efforts of everybody in the early 2000s for cutting those out. But they are definitely still present. Rebecca kept showing them to me and telling me about, that there are still those efforts, and man, it shows. If you didn't have these control efforts, that these species would be back crowding out the natural regeneration very quickly. So, thanks to Rebecca and to others for really trying to keep the invasive plant species under control. It's unfortunately just something that is not going to go away, and just you continually have to pay attention to it and to try and reduce the intensification of the plants where you can. And especially keep them out where they're not currently present. So in conclusion, the old inland fields are reverting to mixed spruce hardwood forests. These will continue to develop as woodlands. The edges of the island will remain open, white spruce forest. It's been like that since the glaciers left and will continue to be that way. And the red spruce forests are doing great and will continue to be red spruce forests into the future, as long as you can keep those invasive species out that suppresses regeneration. As long as you can keep them under control, these forests are going to continually to regenerate and develop, and you're going to have some great woodlands to pass off to the future generations. So my thanks again to everybody who's organized the talk today. My thanks to all of you who were interested in learning more about the island's forest. I've really enjoyed my times out there, and say you've got a lot to look forward to in the future for enjoying your woodlands out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. If we were in person, you would hear a thunderous round of applause. We do have time for questions. If you haven't already submitted a question and wish to do so, please write your question in chat. While you do so, I will start off the questions. And here is mine. What would you say are the key things the Ecology Committee should attend to or find out more about in regards to the health of our wildlands? And what do you see as being our biggest challenge?
Yeah, really the biggest challenge is the invasive plants. And so it is continually trying to figure out effective ways to limit the intensification, and to figure out strategies to try and remove as much as you can. So I think that's still the most imminent threat to the health of the forests out there. And it's something that you can't let up, that if you were to stop trying to control the invasives, they will aggressively colonize the forests on the island.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Nan. So the first question we have, Bill, is how is Japanese barberry removed or controlled?
I don't know, Rebecca, let's see, you're still connected. Do you want to talk about, you know more about that than I do. So I'd like you to talk about that.
about my little screen. It's pretty straightforward. So we just identify areas that we want to work on, and we cut the plant back. We usually cut it down to the ground, and then we go back a year later and we cut it down to the ground again, and then we go back a year later and we cut it down to the ground again, and then oftentimes after 2-3 years, every time we go back and we recut the same plant, it's almost always significantly smaller. So we cut out a large plant, we come back and there are like 2-3 little sprouts, and you cut those out and you go back the next year, maybe there's one little sprout. It's really a matter of making sure you just go back and go back and go back until it's just become too weak to kind of regenerate itself. Sometimes if we go back every year and the root system is weak enough, we can just kind of pull the whole root of the plant right out. If it's young enough, you can just pull it right out of the ground, depending on what else is around. But yeah, we just keep track of where it is and keep cutting it back until it becomes too weak to kind of regenerate itself.
Okay. One thing I do remember about the Japanese barberry that we found from Jennifer's studies is that unlike a lot of bushes like raspberry, where seeds can lay dormant in the soil for decades, that's not true with barberry. That basically you have good seed survival after 1 year, but then after that, the seed doesn't survive very well. So fortunately, you don't have the problem of the seed building up in the soil. But those roots, they hang on forever. So as Rebecca talked about, that they're going to sprout, and so it's a war of attrition as to who's going to give up first, the people cutting it back or the Japanese bush, barberry bush.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Rebecca. The next question is, are mountain ash affected by emerald ash borer, emerald ash borer?
Okay, good question. Fortunately, the mountain ash, the leaf kind of looks like an ash tree, but they're from different plant families, meaning that they're not closely related. So the emerald ash borer will not affect the mountain ash. It is just on the true ash species in the genus Fraxinus. And so the common names, white, green, black ash, and in Maine, those trees are under threat. But mountain ash, no.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you talk about the history of deer on the island?
Not that well. I do know you had a lot of them. And then I think it was because of Lyme disease, the health department said, you got to get rid of the deer. And so they were just gone, had been gone by the time I got out there in the late 90s. Yeah, Claire, did you want to say something?
Yeah, they were brought out, 3-4 were brought out in the 50s by DEM to give the fishermen a source of protein in the winter. But they stopped getting shot for food and they proliferated. And so by the time I got there in the 80s and then thereafter, there were like 50 or 60 deer stunted in growth, eating everybody's gardens, eating a lot of the growth in the forest. But more importantly, they started carrying Lyme disease. So we had a lot of instances of Lyme disease, and the decision was made by the islanders. And after several ways of trying to eliminate them, the decision was made to remove them by experienced sharpshooters from the state. I'm not sure, correct me on that. And they were all removed in the 90s. Since then, the forests have grown back immensely, and because they're not eating them, people's gardens are not infected. And the instances of Lyme disease have disappeared immensely. But bye-bye honey, bye-bye deer. It was a lovely thing. They were great while they lasted, but it had to happen. Anybody else want to add to that, please do.
I think in addition, the herd had gotten so large that actually the island was having a hard time sustaining their food needs. And I think a lot of the deer were actually, when they were culled, were severely undernourished.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill and Claire and Nan, for that. The next question is, barberry seems better. How about bittersweet and black swallowwort? These vines seem to be spreading.
Yeah, they are sweating. I know bittersweet can actually grow up the trees. Swallowwort, that comes in really on disturbed sites. So, but I believe swallowwort is shade intolerant. So it's got to have the sunny disturbed areas is where it'll proliferate. But as soon as it gets shady, it's going to decline. The bittersweet, fortunately, I have not seen high populations out there that I've seen other places, but I've seen poorer locations with bittersweet. So I would say, that's another one that, I would actively, aggressively, wherever you see the bittersweet, get rid of it, just like you would with the barberry. Rebecca, do you have, you've wandered the island much more looking for the invasive. What's your sense of bittersweet and swallowwort out on the trails?
Those are both really significant issues. I think that when you were here on the island, some of the areas where we walked together were some of the areas where barberry was more of an issue than bittersweet. So I don't know that we saw all of the most dense areas of bittersweet while you were here. That's another plant we're just doing our best to try to stay on top of it and try to keep it as contained as possible. Swallowwort is even more challenging because it spreads so quickly. So we're doing our best. We have there's a lot of swallowwort in the village, and we have a little bit of it starting to pop up on the backside of the island. So just in really small patches. So I have those patches all mapped, and I just try to get out once a month or so this time of year and keep it cut back to keep it from developing pods. And yeah, those are some daunting tasks, keeping after those two plants in particular, but we're doing our best with it to keep it as contained as possible.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. So here's the last question that we have right now is, what is your take on some of the books about invasive plants, like Beyond the War on Invasive Species or The New Wild?
I'm not familiar with the books. I'm not sure the take on it. Is it anybody who asked the question?
It's basically, Bill, that we've gone overboard on invasive species and should just let them consider them being the new wild.
Well, it'll be wild. Again, that's why I started the talk with my concept of what do I mean by natural? And for me, natural is where you have species that have adapted to each other. By definition, invasive means it is new. It has not evolved with those plants there. And evolution doesn't happen in one generation. That the adaptation of the species evolves over time. So what I would say, the naturalization of these new species will take generations for that to really develop a sustainable forest. So I would argue that, yes, you can just let it go, and the plants will respond to each other as the way the situation is set up. But to call it natural, not by the way I look at it. The natural is where you have species that have evolved with each other, and that these invasive species coming on are not natural, and they will overwhelm the area, but that is not, you're no longer dealing with a natural system. You've got plants out there, but the natural system has been destroyed, and it cannot be replaced for quite a while. It's going to take a long time for all the species now in that new mixture to develop the adaptive evolutionary relationships that will then provide a stable system that can regenerate itself. So I'm strongly against the idea of just letting invasive species spread when you have a choice of trying to minimize it. With insects, for example, it's, what we're trying to do is introduce natural controls to try and establish some more of these relationships and see more of an adaptive situation. So we're trying to build up that or speed up that naturalization process with some of these invasive insects by introducing the predators and parasites. But short of that, it's, no, I really look at it that when you're dealing with invasive species, it's no longer a natural system.
So thank you so much for that, Bill. I just wanted to see if Fred, whom asked the question, if he wanted to respond in any way, or did that clarify your question?
Well, I would say that these books, they aren't saying that invasives aren't a problem. They're saying that there are plant biologists who are looking at these systems 20 years in instead of, oh my goodness, this thing just showed up on my island. And they're realizing that they're claiming that the plants are adapting much quicker than we would give them credit for. And these books have made the rounds here, and there are a number of people who have read them, and I just wasn't sure what your view of, they aren't saying leave it alone, don't do anything, but there's much more of a sense of that our natural environment, with few exceptions, will really respond quickly to deal with these things. And there are some notable exceptions that everybody agrees with, things like kudzu and things like that are very, very destructive. But anyways, I just was wondering if you had looked at them and had some kind of response to their viewpoint.
No, I appreciate that. And it's, and you're right, not every species is the same. Not every situation is the same. And so I think that is important, is to look at what you've got. And I would say that what really scared me on Monhegan was to see the barberry excluding the natural regeneration. And so I would say under that extreme situation that's when the intervention is definitely warranted. And other areas, for me, it's the regeneration, especially we're dealing with natural stands, it's the regeneration of the next forest. If the native species can be maintained, then you got a system that you can work with. But as soon as you begin to lose your native species, that's when I'm saying it's going too far. So I'm not familiar with the books, but I would say you're right, not every situation is going to be a catastrophe. Where's the line? For me, I would suggest the line is regeneration of the native species. If that is threatened, then you've got a situation to where you need to respond. So thanks for the comment. I think it's important to recognize there are different degrees of problems that need to be recognized.
Good. Well, thank you for that back and forth. It was really enlightening. I have one last question, and the question is, should we replace a clump of invasive with another plant to give competition? And if so, what new plants do you suggest?
What I saw on the island, the trees we have in Maine do a great job of regenerating themselves. And our climate, normally, we lack a dry season, so it really favors regeneration of the trees. So from what I saw there is, if you can keep the invasive out, the natural plants will come in. So I haven't seen a situation. Rebecca may see examples as what Fred had talked about, that severity is going to vary by location. But I would say in most situations, as long as you can keep the invasives out, then you're going to have the native plants come in. And I'm not sure that you actively need to plant something unless you just hate looking at the bare spot and then can plant one of the native species, then that's fine too.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Nan. I'll hand it over to you. We're done with the questions.
So Bill, we are so grateful to you for sharing your insights this evening. I know I am feeling a wave of relief at the positive impressions that you left the island with. It makes me proud of the effort that people have made over the years in the name of sustaining our wildlands. We also thank you for your willingness to do your presentation online. I'd also like to thank the audience for supporting MII's mission with your attendance tonight. And if possible, it would be deeply appreciated if you would consider making a donation to support our work. We can't do it without you. As we move forward, we hope that you will join us again throughout the summer. Mark your calendars. Nathaniel Wheelwright will be speaking on July 21st on being a naturalist in the digital age. D. Whitney King will be sharing his work on Allen Island on August 4th. And the series will wrap up with Sarah Redmond from Springtide Seaweed on August 18th. Please register if you have not already done so. The registration link is located on the Monhegan Associates website under the What We Do drop-down menu, and just go to the Ecology Summer Lecture Series. Hopefully many of you will have the opportunity to return to the island this summer. If so, I hope to see you on the trails. I also hope that you will join us in our effort to leave no trace on our trails so that we can all enjoy the magnificence of our wildlands. And with that, I say thank you again to all of you, and especially to Bill, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks so much, Nan. Nice to see everybody. We'll see you at the next one.
Bye.
Good to
Bye-bye.
see you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you to the Ecology Committee. Great job.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yeah, thank you,
Oh.
Bill. That was just wonderful.
Thanks,
It's been a pleasure, and I hope people get to go out and enjoy the forest even more now that they've learned something about it.
Well, I was just so thrilled about all the regeneration. I mean, in my walks, I'd noticed all the new growth, but once again, in terms of how much of that would be lost over time, in terms of not reaching maturity, I wasn't really clear, but it certainly sounds like we're all on the right track. So that's very refreshing, and the forest is doing what it needs to be doing.
Yeah. Hope I'm still around in another 20 years to come out and see what's happened.
Are explaining why invasives need to be under control.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
may ask you for a sound bite that we can put on a flyer.
Thank you all. Good night.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, Claire. You did a great job.
Good night.
Great
Thank
job,
you.
Nan. Bye, Bill.
Bye-bye.
See
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.